You're not failing. You're being trained. You just don't know it yet. And that misunderstanding is more dangerous than failure itself, because it doesn't just slow you down. It quietly reshapes how you see yourself. Most people don't fail. They misread what failure is and leave too early. Think about the last time something didn't work out for you. Not in theory, in real life. A job you wanted. A message that never got a reply. A plan you believed in that slowly collapsed. There's always a moment right after. Not the loud one. Not the one anyone else notices. The quiet one. You're alone. The room is still. Your phone lights up your face in the dark. You scroll back through everything, searching for where it went wrong. You replay conversations. You question decisions. You start doubting things you were once sure about. And then it arrives. Soft, almost invisible, but heavy enough to change everything. Maybe I'm just not good enough. That sentence doesn't feel dramatic, but it's the one that rewrites your direction. Because from that moment on, it's no longer about what happened. It becomes about what it means. And most people assign the wrong meaning. They treat failure like a verdict, a final decision about their ability, their worth, their future. But what if that's not what it is? What if every rejection, every mistake, every moment that made you question yourself wasn't proof that you're falling behind, but evidence that you're in the middle of being shaped? Here's the truth most people never fully understand. Your brain is not built to make you better. It's built to keep you safe. So when something hurts, when you get rejected, ignored, overlooked, your mind reacts instantly. It tries to pull you away from that experience. It wraps fear in logic and hands it back to you as advice. Be realistic. Maybe this isn't for you. Don't waste your time. But that's not clarity. That's fear. Trying to sound intelligent. Because real growth doesn't feel like progress. It feels like friction. It feels like confusion. It feels like repeating something you're not good at yet. It feels like effort with no immediate reward. And because it feels that way, most people walk away right when it starts working. Failure doesn't break you. It exposes what you haven't built yet. I remember a friend of mine sitting in his car after another rejection email. Engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel. He didn't even open the next message. He just stared ahead and said quietly, "I think I'm done." That was rejection number 15. What he couldn't see was everything that had already changed. His answers were sharper. His thinking was clearer. His confidence was stronger. Every no had been adjusting him in ways he couldn't measure yet. Not breaking him, training him. Months later, when he finally got the offer, people said what they always say. You got lucky. But it wasn't luck. It was repetition. It was correction. It was staying long enough for the process to do its job. The real failure isn't losing. It's leaving before you learn. That's what this is about. Not ignoring failure, not pretending it doesn't hurt, seeing it clearly. Because once you understand what failure really is, you stop reacting to it. And you start using it. In this video, you'll learn how to do exactly that. You'll understand why your mind keeps pulling you away from growth, why most people quit at the exact moment things begin to compound, and how to turn every setback into something that actually moves your life forward. Because from this point on, you don't need more motivation. You need a different interpretation, and once that changes, everything changes with it. So if you know someone right now who feels stuck, discouraged, or quietly losing belief in themselves because things haven't worked out yet, send them this video. They might be closer than they think. They just don't see it yet. Chapter 1. Failure is data, not judgment. 10/10 version. You think you got rejected, but that's not what actually happened. Something didn't work. And your brain turned it into a verdict. You sent the message. You waited. Nothing came back. And in that silence, your mind filled in the meaning. They're not interested. I said something wrong. I shouldn't have tried. But look closely. None of that is fact. That's interpretation. Failure isn't emotional. Your interpretation is. And if you don't separate the two, every setback will feel like proof that something is wrong with you. That's how people slowly lose confidence, without even realizing why. Because the moment something doesn't go your way, your brain skips the most important step. It doesn't ask, what can I learn from this? It jumps straight to, what does this say about me? And that question is dangerous, because it turns a temporary outcome into a permanent identity. This didn't work becomes, I don't work. And once that belief starts to settle in, you don't just stop improving. You start holding yourself back. You hesitate more. You try less. You expect failure before you even begin. Not because you're incapable, but because you misread the data. Failure is not judgment, it's information. But information only becomes useful when you're willing to look at it without defending yourself from it. Think about how this works in any system that actually improves. A scientist runs an experiment. The result isn't what they expected. They don't take it personally. They don't question their worth. They look at the variables. They adjust the inputs. They run it again. Because in that world, failure isn't failure. It's feedback. But in your life, the same process feels personal. And that feeling distorts everything. I once worked with someone who kept getting their ideas rejected in meetings. Not aggressively, not harshly, just consistently overlooked. After a few attempts, you could see the shift. They spoke less. They stopped raising their hand. They started sitting back, watching, instead of contributing. And one day they said something that sounded small, but wasn't. I don't think I'm creative enough for this role. That wasn't truth. That was accumulated misinterpretation. Because what was actually happening had nothing to do with creativity. Their ideas weren't aligned with what leadership cared about. That's it. No lack of talent, no lack of intelligence, just misaligned focus. So, we changed one thing. Instead of asking, what idea do I want to share? They started asking, what problem are they trying to solve right now? And everything shifted. Same person, same brain, same effort. Different interpretation. The next time they spoke, their idea landed. Not because they became smarter overnight, but because they finally used the data. That's the difference most people never make. They experience failure, but they don't extract anything from it, and then they wonder why nothing changes. Failure doesn't break you. It exposes what you haven't built yet. Maybe you haven't built the skill. Maybe you haven't built the awareness. Maybe you haven't built the patience to stay long enough to improve. But that's not a flaw, that's direction. Because once you see what's missing, you know exactly where to focus. But if you turn every failure into a judgment about yourself, you never get that clarity, you just get stuck. Repeating the same patterns, avoiding the same risks, telling yourself the same story. This isn't for me, but it was never about you, it was about the approach. And that's a much better problem to have. Because approaches can change, strategies can improve, skills can be built. But only if you stop protecting your ego long enough to look at what actually happened. So here's the shift. The next time something doesn't go your way, don't ask, what's wrong with me? Ask, what is this showing me? Not emotionally, not defensively, objectively, because when you do that, something powerful happens. You move out of reaction and into control. You stop seeing failure as something that pushes you back, and start using it as something that moves you forward. And once you learn how to read it correctly, you realize something most people never do. You were never being judged. You were being guided. Chapter 2. Your brain is lying to you, or you think you're seeing reality clearly. You're not. You're seeing a version of reality, filtered through a brain that's designed to protect you, not grow you. And that changes everything. Because the moment something goes wrong, your mind doesn't just observe it, it edits it. It selects what to focus on, it amplifies certain details, it ignores others completely. And without realizing it, you start reacting. Not to what actually happened, but to the story your brain built around it. That's why two people can go through the exact same experience and walk away with completely different conclusions. One sees failure, the other sees feedback. Same event, different lens. I remember a guy I knew who started going to the gym consistently for the first time in his life. For the first few weeks, he was locked in, showing up early, tracking his workouts, pushing himself. But then something shifted. One morning, he looked in the mirror longer than usual. No real change, no dramatic transformation. Just the same body he'd always had. And in that moment, something clicked in his head. This isn't working. That thought didn't come from logic. It came from expectation, because in his mind, effort should equal visible results, fast. So even though he had already built discipline, consistency, and strength, his brain ignored all of that. It zoomed in on what was missing, the result. Within a week, he stopped going. Not because he failed, but because his brain convinced him that nothing was happening. That's how powerful this distortion is. You can be improving and still feel like you're stuck. You can be moving forward and still believe you're falling behind, because your brain is biased. It's wired to notice problems faster than progress. It's wired to remember negative outcomes more vividly than positive ones. And most importantly, it's wired to avoid discomfort at all costs, which means the moment something feels uncertain, slow, or difficult, your brain starts looking for a way out, not because it's trying to sabotage you, but because it thinks it's helping you survive. And here's the dangerous part. It doesn't say, "I'm scared." It says, "This isn't working." It disguises fear as logic, so you trust it. You believe the thought, and then you act on it. You stop trying, you pull back. You settle for something easier, and from the outside it looks like you lost motivation. But that's not what happened. You believed the wrong signal. There was a time when I experienced this in a much quieter way. I had been working on something that required a lot of consistency. No applause, no immediate reward. Just showing up, day after day, putting in effort that no one could see. At first I was focused, disciplined, but over time the silence started getting louder. No feedback, no validation, no clear sign that it was leading anywhere. And slowly the thoughts crept in. Maybe this isn't the right path. Maybe I'm wasting time. Maybe I'm just not good at this. None of those thoughts were based on actual evidence. They were based on discomfort, on the gap between effort and visible results. And if I had listened to them, I would have stopped right there, thinking I made a rational decision. But looking back, I see it clearly now. That wasn't clarity, that was my brain trying to escape uncertainty, because uncertainty feels like danger, even when it's not. Your brain doesn't measure progress the way reality does. It doesn't track long-term growth. It doesn't understand delayed results. It reacts to what's immediate, what's visible, what's emotionally intense. That's why a single bad outcome can outweigh 10 small wins in your mind. That's why one rejection can erase weeks of effort. That's why you can be on the right path and still feel like you're going nowhere. You're not broken, you're biased. And once you understand that, something shifts. You stop trusting every thought you have. You start questioning it, not emotionally, objectively. You ask yourself, is this true? Or is this just how it feels right now? That question creates space. And in that space, you regain control. Because now instead of reacting automatically, you can choose your response. You can continue even when it feels slow. You can stay consistent even when it feels pointless. You can keep going even when your brain tells you to stop. That's where real growth happens, not when it feels good, but when it feels uncertain, and you move anyway. Because here's the truth most people never fully accept. Your brain will try to pull you away from anything that can change you, not because it's against you, but because change feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliar feels unsafe. So the next time you feel like quitting, pause. Don't immediately believe the thought that shows up. Look at it, question it, challenge it. Because what feels like failure might just be your brain trying to protect you from the very thing that would move you forward. And if you can see that clearly, you stop being controlled by your thoughts, and you start choosing your direction. Chapter 3. You're growing in ways you can't see. You're waiting for proof, something visible, something undeniable, a result that tells you, yes, this is working. And until you see it, a part of you stays uncertain. You keep showing up, but you're not fully convinced. Because in your mind, progress should look like progress. It should be obvious, measurable, immediate. But that's not how real growth works. Real growth is quiet. It happens underneath the surface, long before it ever shows up in a way you can point to. And that's exactly why most people walk away from it. Because they're looking for results, while everything important is still invisible. There was a time when I started learning how to speak in front of people, not casually, not in small conversations, but actually, standing in front of a room trying to express something clearly, confidently. The first time I did it, I was terrible. My voice felt tight. My thoughts were scattered. I could feel my heartbeat in my chest the entire time. And the worst part wasn't that I messed up. It was that I knew I messed up. I walked away replaying every second in my head thinking, that didn't go well. The second time wasn't much better. Neither was the third. If anything, it felt like I was becoming more aware of everything I was doing wrong. And that awareness made it feel worse, because now it wasn't just discomfort, it was frustration. It felt like effort without progress, and that's the moment most people quit. Not at the beginning, but right after they start. Because once you become aware of your own gaps, it feels like you're moving backward, but you're not. You're seeing clearly for the first time. And clarity, at the beginning, always feels like regression. That's the twist most people miss. The moment you think, I'm getting worse, is often the moment you've actually started improving. Because before that, you didn't know what you didn't know. Now you do. And that awareness is the foundation of skill. But it doesn't feel like progress. It feels like discomfort. It feels like noticing every flaw, every hesitation, every inconsistency. And because it feels that way, people assume nothing is working, so they stop. They step away before the improvement has a chance to show up externally. I saw this happen with someone I trained with at the gym. At first, everything felt new to him. Every workout felt like progress. He was learning movements, building routine, feeling motivated. But after a few weeks, something changed. He started noticing details. His form wasn't perfect. His strength wasn't increasing as fast as he expected. He compared himself to others and felt behind. And one day he said, "I think I plateaued." But he hadn't. He had just become aware. Before, he was guessing. Now he was paying attention, and that shift made it feel like he wasn't improving, even though he was. Because growth had moved from obvious to subtle, from visible to internal. And that's where it stays for a while, long enough to test your patience, long enough to make you question everything, long enough to make quitting feel reasonable. But here's what's actually happening during that phase. Your body is adapting, your mind is organizing information. Your skill is refining at a level you can't yet measure. You're building coordination, you're building awareness, you're building control. None of that shows up immediately in results, but all of it determines the results that come later. This is the part people skip. They want the outcome, without staying through the invisible phase that creates it. And that's why it feels like some people suddenly get better. They don't. You're just seeing the moment when their internal progress finally becomes visible. It looks like a jump. But it's actually a buildup. The truth is, progress is delayed, not absent. But your brain doesn't like delays. It wants confirmation now. It wants reassurance now. It wants to know that what you're doing is worth it. And when it doesn't get that, it starts sending signals. This isn't working. You're wasting time. You should try something else. But those signals aren't based on reality. They're based on impatience. And if you follow them, you interrupt the process every time it starts to matter. That's why consistency feels so hard. Not because the work is impossible, but because the results are invisible for longer than most people can tolerate. And in that gap, belief becomes everything. Belief that what you're doing is building something, even if you can't see it yet. Because if you don't have that belief, you rely on evidence. And the evidence won't show up early enough to keep you going. So you quit, right before the shift, right before the moment where things start to connect, right before the results begin to reflect the work you've already done. That's the pattern. And once you see it, you can't ignore it anymore. You realize that the hardest phase isn't failure. It's the phase where nothing seems to be happening. But everything is. That's where most people leave. And that's why most people never experience what's on the other side of it. So the question isn't whether you're progressing. It's whether you're willing to continue when you can't prove that you are. Because that's the real test. Not skill, not talent. Patience. Trust in the process. Before the process rewards you. And once you understand that, something changes. You stop chasing immediate results. You start paying attention to small shifts. You notice that your reactions are different. Your awareness is sharper. Your control is improving. You begin to see progress where you used to see nothing, and that changes how you show up, because now you're not working for instant results. You're building something deeper, something that lasts, something that compounds. So the next time you feel like nothing is happening, pause, look closer, ask yourself, what has changed that I'm not giving myself credit for? Because chances are more is happening than you think. You're just looking in the wrong place. And once you start seeing that clearly, you stop quitting in the invisible phase, and you finally stay long enough to see what you've been building all along. Chapter 4. Most people quit during training. It doesn't look like quitting. That's what makes it dangerous. Most people don't wake up one day and say, "I'm done." They don't slam the door. They don't make a dramatic exit. They slowly disconnect. They show up a little less. They try a little less. They stop caring just enough to protect themselves from disappointment. And from the outside, it looks reasonable. It's just not the right time. I need to focus on something else. Maybe this isn't for me. But if you look closely, it's almost always happening at the same point. Not at the beginning, and not at the end. Right in the middle. Right in the training phase. the part where it's no longer exciting, but not yet rewarding. That's where most people disappear. Because at the beginning, everything feels new. There's energy. There's momentum. Even small effort feels like progress. But after a while, the novelty fades. You've seen the process. You know what it requires. And now it's just repetition. No applause. No instant results. No clear sign that you're getting closer. Just work. And this is where the story in your head starts to shift. At first it was, I'm building something. Now it becomes, what if this leads nowhere? That question is subtle, but it's enough to weaken your consistency. Because once doubt enters, effort changes. You still show up, but not fully. You still try, but not with the same intensity, and eventually the outcome reflects that. Then you look at the result and say, see, it didn't work, but it didn't fail. You left. I remember a friend who started a small online business. Nothing huge, just something he believed in. He put time into it every day after work, learning, building, testing. The first few weeks felt exciting. Every small step felt like progress. Then came the silence. No customers, no traction, no feedback. Weeks turned into months, and nothing seemed to change. One night, we were talking, and he said something that sounded calm, but wasn't. I think I gave it a fair shot. On the surface, that sounds reasonable, but when we broke it down, it wasn't really true. He had been consistent, but not long enough for anything to compound. He had learned, but not long enough to master anything. He had tried, but not long enough to adapt properly. He didn't fail. He stopped during training, and that's the pattern most people never see. They expect results before the system has time to work. They expect clarity before they've gathered enough experience. They expect confidence before they've earned it. So when those things don't show up early, they interpret it as a sign to stop. But it's not a signal to stop, it's a signal to continue. Because real progress doesn't move in a straight line, it builds quietly. For a long time it looks flat, then suddenly it moves. And if you leave before that shift, it will always feel like it never worked. Not because it doesn't, but because you never stayed long enough to see it. This happens in more places than you think. In fitness, in relationships, in skills, in careers. People commit, but only until it becomes uncomfortable, only until it requires patience, only until they stop getting immediate feedback. Then they step back, not completely, just enough to slow everything down, and that's why they stay in the same place. Not because they lack potential, but because they keep interrupting the process. There's a moment in every journey where things get quiet, where the effort continues, but the results don't reflect it yet, where you start asking yourself, is this worth it? That moment is not a warning, it's a threshold, and how you respond to it determines everything that comes next. Because on one side of that threshold is doubt, on the other side is momentum. But you don't get to see the difference unless you stay. That's the part no one talks about. Consistency isn't just about discipline, it's about staying when nothing is confirming your decision. It's about continuing when the process feels repetitive, slow, and uncertain. It's about trusting something you can't yet prove. That's why so few people reach the next level. Not because it's impossible, but because it requires a kind of patience that feels uncomfortable, a kind of persistence that feels unnecessary until it isn't. I've seen this in my own life more than once. Working on something for weeks, sometimes months, with no visible progress. Questioning whether it made sense to continue. Thinking about stopping. Not out of laziness, but out of doubt. And every time I stayed just a little longer than I wanted to, something shifted, not instantly, but noticeably. Things started connecting, results started appearing, effort started making sense. And in those moments it became clear. The process was working the entire time. I just couldn't see it yet. That's the trap. You assume something isn't working because you can't see the outcome. But the outcome isn't the only indicator of progress. Sometimes the real progress is happening in your ability to stay, to keep showing up, to keep adjusting, to keep going when it would be easier to stop. That's what builds momentum, not intensity, duration. The real difference between people who succeed and those who don't isn't talent. It's how long they stay in the process after it stops being exciting. So the next time you feel like stepping away, pause. Not because you're forcing yourself to continue blindly, but because you understand what's actually happening. You're not stuck. You're in the phase most people never get through. And if you can recognize that, if you can stay just a little longer, you won't just avoid quitting. You'll cross the point where things finally start to move, and when that happens, it won't feel like luck. It will feel like clarity. Because you'll finally see what was there all along. The process was never broken. You just needed to stay in it long enough for it to reveal itself. Chapter 5. Pain is your fastest teacher. Most people try to avoid pain, not just physical pain, emotional pain, psychological discomfort, the kind that makes your chest feel tight, your thoughts heavy, your confidence unstable. They avoid it quietly. They distract themselves. They rationalize their way out of it. They move on too quickly, before they've actually understood it. And that's why they stay the same. Because pain, when you face it correctly, is one of the most efficient forms of feedback you will ever get. It doesn't whisper. It doesn't hint. It forces you to pay attention. Think about the last time something really hurt. Not just inconvenient, not just uncomfortable, something that stayed with you. Maybe it was a mistake that cost you money. Maybe it was a decision that affected someone you care about. Maybe it was a moment where you realized you weren't who you thought you were. Those moments are different. They don't fade quickly. They sit with you. And if you're honest, they change you. Not because you wanted them to, but because you couldn't ignore them. I knew someone who made a financial decision they didn't fully understand. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't impulsive. It just came from a place of overconfidence. At first, everything looked fine. Then slowly, things started going wrong. Numbers didn't add up. Returns didn't come in. And eventually, the loss became real. It wasn't small, and it wasn't just about the money. It was the realization behind it. I didn't know what I thought I knew. That moment hit harder than the loss itself, because it exposed something deeper, a gap in understanding, a blind spot in judgment, a level of confidence that wasn't supported by real knowledge, and for a while, it hurt. Not in a dramatic way, in a quiet, persistent way. The kind of discomfort that makes you replay decisions, that makes you question yourself, that forces you to sit with the reality of what happened. Most people try to escape that feeling. They distract themselves, they blame the situation, they move on as quickly as possible, but he didn't. He stayed with it. He looked at every decision that led up to that moment. He broke down what he missed. He learned how things actually worked. And slowly, something changed. Not just his strategy, his awareness, his caution, his discipline, his ability to see risk clearly. That loss became a turning point. Not because losing is good, but because he used the pain instead of running from it. That's the difference. Pain by itself doesn't make you better. It just gets your attention. What you do after that determines everything. Because pain reveals. It shows you where you were careless, where you were unaware, where you were unprepared. It highlights the exact place where something needs to change. But if you avoid it, you lose that clarity. You lose the lesson. And then the same pattern repeats. Maybe in a different form, maybe in a different area. But the core problem stays the same. That's why some people go through the same situations over and over again. Same mistakes. Same outcomes, same frustrations. Not because they're incapable, but because they never stayed long enough in the discomfort to understand it. Pain is precise. It points directly to what matters. But only if you're willing to look at it without trying to escape it. There's a moment right after something goes wrong where you have a choice. You can react, or you can reflect. Reaction is immediate. You protect yourself. You justify. You move on. Reflection is slower. You sit with it. You analyze it. You ask uncomfortable questions. What did I miss? What did I ignore? What would I do differently? Those questions don't feel good, but they move you forward, because they turn pain into insight, and insight into change. That's how growth actually happens, not through comfort, through awareness. And awareness often comes from discomfort. There was a time when I avoided that process. Something would go wrong and I would immediately try to move past it, stay positive, stay focused, not dwell on it. It felt productive, but it wasn't. Because I kept repeating the same patterns, different situations, same outcomes. It wasn't until I slowed down and started actually looking at what hurt, not just the situation, but my role in it, that things started to shift, not instantly, but clearly. Because once you see something honestly, you can't unsee it. And once you understand it, you don't repeat it the same way again. That's what pain gives you. Clarity. Not the kind you get from thinking about things in theory, the kind you get from experiencing something deeply enough that it changes how you act. That's why pain is such an effective teacher. It makes the lesson stick. You don't forget it. You don't overlook it. You carry it with you, and it shapes your decisions moving forward. But again, only if you use it. Because pain can either make you better or make you more defensive. It depends on how you respond to it. If you treat it as something to avoid, you stay the same. If you treat it as something to understand, you evolve. That's the shift, not avoiding discomfort, using it. So the next time something hurts, don't rush to get past it. Pause. Stay with it a little longer than you want to. Look at it clearly. Not to judge yourself, but to understand what it's showing you. Because inside that discomfort, there's direction, there's information, there's something you need to see. And once you see it, you don't just recover from the situation, you grow from it, and that's what most people miss. They go through pain, but they don't extract anything from it. So it happens again and again, until they finally stop running and start paying attention. Because when you do that, pain stops being something you fear and becomes something you learn from. And once that happens, you don't just survive difficult moments, you use them, and that changes everything. Chapter 6. The story you tell yourself becomes your identity. It doesn't start as identity. It starts as a sentence, something small, something you say in your head without thinking too much about it. I'm just not good at this. I've never been confident. I always mess things up. At first it feels harmless, just a reaction, just a way to explain what happened. But the more you repeat it, the more it begins to settle, not as a thought, as a belief. And once it becomes a belief, it starts shaping how you move, because you don't act based on reality, you act based on the story you believe about yourself. That's the part most people never question. They think they're stuck because of circumstances, because of past experiences, because of limitations they assume are fixed. But if you look closely, what's really guiding their behavior is something much quieter, a narrative, a pattern of interpretation that gets repeated until it feels like truth. I knew someone who believed they were bad at communication. Not because anyone told them that directly, but because of a few moments that didn't go well. They stumbled over words in a meeting. They felt awkward in conversations. They got misunderstood once or twice. And from those moments, a conclusion formed. I'm not good at expressing myself. It didn't happen all at once. It built slowly. Each new situation became confirmation. Each uncomfortable interaction became proof. So what did they do? They spoke less. They avoided situations where they might have to explain something clearly. They held back ideas, even when they had something valuable to say. Not because they didn't have the ability, but because they had accepted the identity. And once you accept an identity, you start protecting it. That's the twist. You don't just live with your beliefs. You act in ways that reinforce them. If you believe you're not confident, you avoid situations that require confidence. If you believe you're not disciplined, you don't push yourself when it gets hard. If you believe you're not capable, you don't take risks that would prove otherwise. And then the result matches the belief, which makes it feel real. But it was never fixed, it was reinforced. There's a difference. One day we had a conversation about this. Not about communication techniques, not about strategies, just about the story. I asked a simple question. What if that's not who you are, but just how you've been interpreting your experiences? There was a pause. Because that question creates space. It separates the person from the pattern. And once you see that separation, something shifts. Because now the identity isn't permanent, it's adjustable. We didn't try to replace the belief with something unrealistic like, I'm amazing at communication. That doesn't work. Instead, we changed one line from, I'm bad at communication, to, I'm learning how to communicate better. It seems small, but it changes everything. Because the first statement closes the door, the second one opens it. Now every interaction isn't a test of identity, it's part of the process, a moment to improve, a piece of feedback, a step forward, and slowly, the behavior changed. They started speaking more, not perfectly, not confidently at first, but consistently. And with each repetition, the identity shifted, not because they forced it, but because they gave it room to evolve. That's how identity actually changes, not through motivation, through interpretation. The way you explain your experiences determines the direction you move in, and most people never realize they have control over that explanation. They assume their thoughts are accurate. They assume their conclusions are final. But they're not. They're just familiar. And familiarity feels like truth, but it isn't. Your identity is not a fixed description of who you are. It's a reflection of what you've repeated, internally and externally. The thoughts you've reinforced, the behaviors you've allowed, the meaning you've assigned to what happens to you, and that means it can change, but only if you become aware of it. Only if you start paying attention to the sentences that run in the background, because those sentences are shaping your actions more than anything else. There was a time when I caught myself doing this, not in a dramatic way, in small moments. Something wouldn't go well and I would immediately label it. I'm not good at this. It felt automatic, but once I started noticing it, I realized how often it happened, and more importantly, how it affected what I did next. Because after that thought, I would pull back, I would hesitate, I would lower my effort, not consciously, just slightly, but enough to keep me in the same place. So I changed the way I responded, not the situation, not the outcome, the interpretation. Instead of labeling the result, I started questioning it. What part of this can I improve? What did this show me? What would I do differently next time? Those questions don't protect your identity. They build it. Because now you're not reacting to what happened. You're using it. And over time, that creates a different version of you. Not instantly, but consistently. That's the shift most people never make. They try to change their results without changing the story behind them. But the story is what drives the behavior, and the behavior is what creates the result. So if you want something different, you have to start there, not with what you do, with how you see. Because the moment you stop saying, "This is who I am," and start saying, "This is what I'm learning," you give yourself permission to grow. You stop protecting a fixed identity, and you start building a flexible one. And once that happens, failure doesn't threaten who you are anymore. It shapes who you're becoming. And that changes everything. Chapter 7. Stop reacting, start decoding. Most people don't actually deal with their problems. They react to them. Something happens, and they respond instantly. Emotion first, action second. Understanding never. A message comes in that feels off. You reply quickly. A plan falls apart. You panic and switch direction. Someone pulls away. You assume the worst. It all feels natural. It feels honest. But it's not accurate. Because reaction is immediate. And anything immediate is usually incomplete. You're responding to a fraction of the situation, not the full picture. That's why the same types of problems keep showing up. Different people, different situations, same emotional outcome. And after a while, it starts to feel personal. Why does this keep happening to me? But that's the wrong question. The better question is, what am I not seeing? Because most of the time, the problem isn't random, it's patterned. It repeats because something underneath it hasn't been understood yet. And until you see that pattern, you stay stuck reacting to the surface. I remember a conversation with someone who kept running into the same issue in relationships. At the beginning, everything felt strong. Connection, excitement, attention. But after a few weeks or months, things would shift. Communication would slow down. Energy would change. And eventually, the distance would grow. Every time the conclusion was the same. I just haven't met the right person yet. And on the surface, that made sense. Each situation looked different. Different people. Different dynamics. But the outcome was identical, so we stepped back. Not to analyze the other person, to analyze the pattern. What actually happens at the beginning? What changes over time? What are you doing consistently in each situation? At first it was uncomfortable, because it meant looking at their own behavior, not just what was happening to them. And slowly, something started to become clear. At the beginning of every connection, they overinvested. Constant communication, immediate availability, high emotional energy. It felt like effort. It felt like commitment. But it was actually imbalance, because over time that intensity couldn't be sustained. So when it naturally dropped, it felt like something was wrong. To them, and to the other person. That shift created confusion. Distance followed, and the cycle repeated. Same pattern, different people. That's when it clicked. The issue wasn't who they were meeting. It was how they were showing up. That realization changed everything, because now the focus wasn't on finding a different outcome. It was on changing the pattern that created the outcome. And once they adjusted their behavior, pacing their communication, maintaining consistency instead of intensity, everything shifted. Not instantly, but clearly. Because the pattern changed. That's what most people miss. They look at problems as isolated events, but they're not. They're signals. They're patterns repeating until you understand them. And if you keep reacting emotionally every time something goes wrong, you never get to that level. You stay at the surface. You fix the symptom. You never address the cause. Decoding is different. Decoding means stepping back, not ignoring the situation, not suppressing emotion, but slowing it down enough to see it clearly. It means asking better questions, not, why is this happening to me? But what is this showing me? What's consistent here? What am I doing that contributes to this? What pattern keeps repeating? Those questions don't feel comfortable because they shift responsibility, not blame, responsibility. And that's where control comes from. Because once you see a pattern, you can change it. But until you see it, you're stuck inside it, reacting to it, reinforcing it, and calling it bad luck. There was a point where I had to face this myself. Different situations, same outcome. At first it felt random, unlucky timing, wrong circumstances, but after a while it became harder to ignore. The similarities were too consistent, so I stopped looking at what was happening and started looking at how I was responding. Where was I rushing? Where was I assuming? Where was I reacting instead of understanding? And the answers weren't comfortable, but they were clear. I wasn't giving things time to develop. I was making decisions based on emotion, not observation. I was reacting to moments, instead of reading patterns. Once I saw that, everything changed. Not overnight, but directionally. Because now I wasn't guessing, I was adjusting. That's the difference between reacting and decoding. Reaction is fast. Decoding is deliberate. Reaction feels right. Decoding reveals what's real. And in the long run, only one of those leads to progress. Because patterns don't disappear on their own. They repeat until you recognize them. And once you do, you can interrupt them. You can choose a different response. You can create a different outcome. But only if you slow down long enough to see what's actually happening. So the next time something goes wrong, pause. Not for long. Just enough. Long enough to stop the automatic reaction. Long enough to look at it objectively. Ask yourself, have I seen this before? Because if the answer is yes, then it's not just a situation, it's a pattern. And if it's a pattern, then it's something you can change. Once you stop reacting to what's happening and start decoding why it keeps happening, you don't just solve the problem, you stop creating it. And that's where real control begins. Chapter 8. Turn failure into a system. Most people experience failure. Very few people use it. They go through something difficult, feel the impact, think about it for a moment, and then move on. Not because they don't care, but because they don't have a way to capture what just happened. So, the lesson fades, and when a similar situation shows up again, they respond the same way, not intentionally, just unconsciously. That's why progress feels inconsistent. Because without a system, growth becomes accidental, and accidental growth doesn't last. If you really look at it, the difference between someone who improves quickly and someone who stays stuck isn't effort, it's structure. One person goes through failure and forgets it. The other goes through failure and extracts something from it. That extraction is what turns experience into progress. There was a time when I noticed this pattern in my own life. Things would happen, good or bad, and I would reflect on them briefly. Maybe think about what I could have done better. But there was no consistency, no structure. So, even though I was gaining experience, I wasn't really building on it. It was scattered. And then I started doing something simple, not complicated, not time-consuming, just intentional. After anything that felt like a failure, or even just something that didn't go the way I expected, I would pause and write down 4 things. What happened? Why it happened? What I would change next time? What I would keep doing? That was it. At first it felt unnecessary, almost too simple. But over time, something started to shift. Patterns became clearer. Mistakes became harder to repeat. Decisions became more precise. Because now I wasn't just experiencing situations, I was learning from them, systematically. That's the difference. Failure by itself is random. A system makes it useful. Most people think they need more discipline, more motivation, more consistency. But what they actually need is a way to understand what they're going through. Because when you understand it, you naturally adjust. And those adjustments compound. That's how progress accelerates. Not by avoiding failure, by organizing it. I saw this again with someone who was trying to improve their performance at work. They were capable, smart, hardworking, but they kept making small mistakes. Nothing major, just enough to hold them back. And it frustrated them, because from their perspective, they were trying. They were putting in effort, but the results weren't matching, so instead of pushing harder, we slowed things down. After each project, instead of moving on immediately, they reviewed it, not emotionally, objectively. What worked? What didn't? What specifically caused the issue? What would I do differently next time? At first it felt repetitive, but after a few weeks something changed. They stopped making the same mistakes, not because they suddenly became better, but because they were paying attention. The system was doing the work. It was catching patterns early. It was reinforcing what worked. It was eliminating what didn't, and over time their performance didn't just improve, it stabilized. That's what a system gives you. Not just progress, consistency, because now you're not relying on memory. You're not relying on emotion. You're not relying on how you feel in the moment. You have something to refer back to, something concrete, something real. That's how you turn failure into an advantage. Not by thinking about it more, but by processing it better. Because thinking is passive, processing is active, and active learning creates change. There's a moment after every setback where you have a choice. You can move on quickly, or you can pause and capture something from it. Most people move on because it's easier, because they don't want to sit in discomfort, because they assume they'll remember, but they don't, and that's why the same lessons keep repeating, in different forms, at different times, with the same outcome, until you decide to stop letting experience pass through you and start using it. That's the shift, from reacting to recording, from feeling to understanding, from random growth to intentional growth. And once you make that shift, something powerful happens. You stop fearing failure, because now every situation, well, even the ones that don't go well, has value. You're extracting something from it. You're building something from it. You're moving forward, even when it doesn't feel like it. That changes your relationship with everything. You take more risks. You try more things. You stay longer in difficult situations. Because now you're not just hoping it works. You're learning either way. That's what gives you confidence, not success. Clarity. Clarity that no matter what happens, you're going to take something from it, and that something will make you better. So the next time something doesn't go the way you expected, don't rush past it. Pause. Not for long. Just enough to ask the right questions. What happened? Why? What will I change? What will I keep? Write it down. Make it real. Because once you do that, you're no longer someone who just experiences failure. You become someone who uses it, and that's a completely different path. Because people who use failure don't stay where they are. They evolve. They adapt. They improve in ways that are consistent and measurable. Not because they avoid mistakes, but because they don't waste them. And once you stop wasting failure, it stops being something that holds you back and becomes something that moves you forward. At the beginning of this video, we changed one idea. You thought you were failing. Now you see it differently. You're being trained. And once that shift happens, everything else starts to make sense, because failure was never the problem. The way you understood it was. You saw it as judgment, when it was actually data. You trusted your thoughts, but without realizing your brain was trying to protect you, not grow you. You expected visible results, while most of your progress was happening where you couldn't see it. You questioned the process, right at the point where most people quit. You avoided discomfort, not realizing pain was trying to teach you something. You labeled yourself, instead of recognizing you were still learning. You reacted to situations instead of decoding the patterns behind them, and you moved on too quickly, without turning your experiences into something you could actually use. That's what kept you stuck. Not a lack of ability, not a lack of opportunity, a lack of clarity. But now you have that clarity, and clarity changes how you act. Because from this point on, when something doesn't go your way, you don't immediately assume the worst. You pause. You look at it differently. You ask better questions. Instead of asking, why is this happening to me? You ask, what is this trying to show me? Instead of thinking, I'm not good enough, you think, what can I improve? Instead of reacting, you start understanding. And that's where control begins. But understanding alone isn't enough. You have to use it. So here's what I want you to do. Not someday. Not when you feel ready. Today. Think about one recent situation that didn't go the way you wanted. Just one. Don't overcomplicate it. Now take a moment and break it down. What actually happened? Not the story, not the emotion, just the facts. Why did it happen? Be honest, not defensive. What would you change next time? Be specific. And what did you do well that you should keep? That simple process, why we're what, if you actually use it, will change how you grow. Because now you're not just going through experiences, you're learning from them. And when you learn consistently, progress becomes inevitable, not fast, not dramatic, but real and lasting. This is where most people fall off. They understand the idea. They feel motivated, but they don't apply it. And without application, nothing changes. So don't just listen to this. Use it. Even in small ways, because small awareness, repeated over time, becomes a completely different life. A life where failure doesn't stop you. It builds you. A life where setbacks don't break your confidence. They strengthen it. A life where you don't wait for things to work. You make them work, step by step, adjustment by adjustment. That's the path you're on now, whether you realize it or not. And if you stay on it, if you keep showing up, keep learning, keep adjusting, you won't just see different results. You'll become a different person. So if this video helped you see things more clearly, even just a little, share it with someone who needs to hear this right now. Someone who feels stuck. Someone who's starting to doubt themselves. Someone who might be closer than they think, but can't see it yet. Because sometimes one shift in perspective is all it takes to change everything. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next video.